Hi, my name is Enver Villamizar with Workers Forum, and I'm here today with Christine Nugent, representative of the Berrien District Injured Workers Group, as well as the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups. Thanks for joining me today, Christine.
And thank you for having us.
Today we are in Windsor, Ontario at the site of a monument which is part of a network of monuments across Canada dedicated to the memory of injured workers and the fight in the present for the rights of injured workers and a compensation system that affirms those rights. This particular monument was dedicated 30 years ago on April 28th, actually very close to this month. Today we're talking about June 1st, which in Ontario is pretty well known at this point as Injured Workers Day. It marks the occasion when 40 years ago, injured workers and their allies marched on the Ontario legislature to make sure that their voices were heard in the context of reforms that the government was making at that time to the compensation system, and actually forced the government to hold the hearings out on the lawn, which was very symbolic to make sure
Too many people,
and that it had to be, these discussions couldn't be done in private and secret without those who were affected by it, right? So since that time, injured workers groups have been fighting tooth and nail to make sure that at every point their concerns, their experience is brought to light, and that they can't just be disappeared through these backdoor consultations or other reforms, and we'll get to what we're talking about today, which they call audits. One of the major issues for this June 1st Injured Workers Day that ONIWIG has been raising is how the system of workers' compensation is being restructured at this time. At present, one of the big four accounting firms globally, called KPMG, is being put in a position to decide the changes that are required for the compensation system, in the form of giving them the ability to do what are called value for money audits. So this is something that they do globally. If you look for value for money audits, this is KPMG's one of their things. Now for workers, their labor creates a ton of value for the companies that employ them, but they don't get a lot of that money back in the form of compensation. So obviously value for money is a very big concern of the workers, but what the concern of KPMG is and of WSIB is and the Ontario government, we're going to discuss today. KPMG defines these value for money audits as an, quote, objective, professional, and systematic examination of systems and procedures that management has established to ensure, one, financial, human, and physical resources are managed with due regard to economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, and two, accountability relationships are served. So from this, it seems that the Workers' Safety and Insurance Board is using KPMG to create the impression that the problem in the workers' compensation system comes from the way it's managed, and that it needs to be basically more efficient. Can you tell us about what they're proposing as part of this audit is required to change the compensation system, and what effect these changes may have on the actual workers themselves?
Sure. The KPMG is not new to us, to the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Group. This is the third time they do a value for, an audit for so-called value. And so our fight has been against KPMG before. And I'll talk a bit about now, but very clearly in 2014, there was an attempt to facilitate the WSIB, the Workers' Safety Insurance Board, with ways and means to deny workers compensation. So they came up with a variety of policies, and the policies were such that they didn't even have to change the law. They could just implement the policies, and this is where people were denied compensation because of precondition, for example, and we remember that's been a big fight. And
so those are saying that the person already had a pre-existing condition, and therefore they don't get the right compensation,
even though that worker's hired, working with that so-called precondition. So we've been fighting since 2014 on that issue. We've made some headway. They're finding it more difficult to deny workers compensation because we're aware, the groups are aware, and so we're able to advocate on that front. So, and I've been told by, advocates that they even had a previous occasion where they facilitated, denying compensation to just compensation. So today, our fight with the latest audit is on the issue of timelines. So workers, and I can speak to my own Barrie group and the people, of the 25 people we facilitate, and that they're facing not knowing what to do, not knowing how to get care, not knowing how to get finances to put food on their table, just not knowing where to turn. And so the groups play that role. And what KPMG has told the workers' compensation system is that you're giving these workers too much time to appeal. They're giving way too much time. You're giving them 6 months. Let's make that 1 month.
And the appeal is to appeal of what compensation they're entitled to. Is that the idea?
Well, the denials.
The denial of it.
The denials. And, I spoke a bit about how they deny.
Yeah.
But so the denials are prolific out there.
Yeah.
So, of course, it takes time to see a doctor, to get a doctor's report, to get to the specialist that the doctor is sending you to, the wait for the specialist. If you figured out how to even do that, if your employer filed the proper form because it was an on duty, if you knew how to file the proper form. So all of this takes time. So KPMG, in their wisdom, figured out an efficiency of, let's just cut all this timeline. You're just giving too much time for these things to happen. And there's a lot of information about how, in different ways, that they're cutting, the appeals and how many appeals and how long it takes you to get there. Of course, the workers don't want a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a grain of truth to that.
Right.
You don't want to wait a long time before you get things settled. So it sounds like it's in their interest. But the conditions of healthcare in society, the knowledge, the representation. So this is an attack on workers having representation. And if you think about it, there's 30% that are unionized, and all the rest are non-union. So how does the representation take place? So for the non-union workers, they have to go to the Office of the Worker Advisor. How long does that take? So in my experience with our members, they have waited up to a year before they even get to have a paralegal or representation. Office of the Worker Advisor, by law, has to represent non-union workers, which we fought for 30 years ago. So that exists, but the timeline is ridiculous.
Right.
So workers have to pay lawyers. By the time they realize the time has gone by, so then there's more time, right? And that's not good for the worker, but it's also now going to be difficult to even follow through. For unionized workers, and we can speak to some of the health and safety representatives in the unions who are looking at this, and some of them are saying, especially UFCW, they're saying they're 3 years behind in representing the workers they have.
Right.
So now the audit is saying, make it more difficult for workers to appeal denials, and the denials happen on all kinds of fronts. So this is the issue at this time, and what's disturbing is you would think it's illegal.
Right.
Right? You would think, well, it's got to be a violation of the law, and it is. It's a violation of the law. And what we have found happens is all of a sudden what is a violation of the law, the Ford government will change that law, and we expect that. But in the meantime, the board is allowed, or the compensation system is allowed to put policies in place, which is over and above the law. And that's what happened in 2014. That's our experience.
Seems like it's very similar to the way the insurance industry works, where the whole goal is to get you to give up a claim, to shrink the timelines, make it more onerous on you. So at the end of the day, if you're injured, you're in pain, you just say, you know what, to heck with it. So clearly this is their conception of efficiency, is making it more efficient to cut people off rather than more efficient to
and force them back to work when they're not ready to go. So this ends up being the injustice of return to work before you're ready to go, even before your family doctor says so, or you're waiting for the specialist. So now you're in return to work, and you're calling your injured worker groups about, what do I do about this? I'm not ready to work.
Right.
So then you're facing that battle. So that's what's going to increase, is unjust return to work. And then if you appeal that, there's another cut to how long you have to appeal.
If you appeal the return to work requirement.
Yeah. So anytime you intend to object to something, you're facing restrictive timelines.
Now all this is happening at the same time, as you said a bit earlier, as the Ford government is making other changes where they're basically trying to withdraw funds from the system that should be there for injured workers. They're reducing the rebates that employers are required to put forward, given all the value they receive from workers, that in the case there are injuries, they're supposed to put these rebates forward. Those have been reduced. The practice of deeming, trying to find ways to cut people off. So, I mean, for the government, for KPMG to say this is about efficiency and improving the system at the same time as they're making these cuts, it seems like the real goal is to hide their attempt to again restructure the system on the backs of the very workers it's supposed to be there to protect.
Well, the rebates have been going on through all political parties under all governments.
Yeah.
So that's why we ended up having a 40th anniversary, because up to that protest on June 1st, where there were several thousand outside the legislature, there was the beginning of the pressure on the system. And that was through rebates, through giving employers the ability to lower their premiums. So then supposedly that developed an unfunded liability. Now the unfunded liability is the fight we had to deny that you needed to have 100% funding, right? Because you don't pay out to everybody, and let's be clear that this is affecting our permanent injured workers, this whole issue. The 400,000 that are injured, you have 40,000 that are permanently injured, okay? And so these are the people that are suffering through these kinds of mechanisms that they're using in order to hand employers more funds. So at this point it isn't rebates, it's actually handing them money,
right?
Because they're in a surplus. And the international financiers decided that if the compensation board didn't have 100% funding, then, this is the Attorney General, then the debt would go on to the general population of Ontario. And so now they're funded 100%, at least 15 years earlier than they planned, and now they have billions and they're handing them out. So that happened on the backs of injured workers, and now we have a situation where they want to maintain 100% on the backs of injured workers through these kind of audits and methods that they're using to make life more difficult, for those workers.
So obviously, given what's taking place, the role of the injured workers groups and of Oniwag, it's reaffirmed the importance of having your own voice and being able to speak about these things. What are the main demands for this June 1st that are being put forward, besides the demands not to follow what KPMG is dictating? And how can people join the work and join the campaign this June 1st? So
the first thing is no more KPMG audits, and to reverse what is on the agenda for the government and the compensation board. There was a promise of making the injured worker pensions to be 90% as opposed to 80% last year, and we haven't seen that yet. So, okay, you made that promise, but you aren't following through. The issue of the cost of living is huge, right, because we've had to do these legal challenges on them claiming it's only 2%, just and trying to get away with that. Of course, the deeming you mentioned, and deeming is where you're forced into a job, and if you don't take it or you can't do it, your pension is cut.
And these jobs may not even exist.
And during the
phantom
pandemic,
jobs.
yeah, and during the pandemic, this was horrible for
right,
workers. And recently, one worker that reached the 65 years. So we used to have pensions for life, and that changed. That's in now it's like at 65 you're cut off your compensation,
right,
completely. Now, if you think about it, if you've been injured for 20 years, there's no money going into CPP. Right? So they put 5% in, but that's of your old wage. So at 65, you get this lump sum, and it doesn't match. So you're actually heading into poverty. Right. But one fight they're having is once a worker gets the lump sum, they're taxed on it.
Oh, geez.
So we have workers that are fighting that with the federal government and the compensation system right now. So I think that pretty well covers those demands that we have right now.
And we're talking about workers who are even covered by WSIB. There's whole sections of workers in Ontario who don't even have access.
So there's 30%. We don't have universal coverage, and a lot of people are shocked at that my physiotherapist's office is not covered under WSIB.
Right.
All the banks.
Yeah.
So
and then you have the workers who, migrant workers come in some of these programs that don't have access as well.
That's right. So there is a large number of workers that aren't covered. And if they were covered, then, that would serve the system, would it not? And yeah.
So June 1st, normally there's an event in Toronto, and in some cases there's local actions. What's happening this year on that day?
So we want to, make clear that it's 40 years since, we were storming the legislature, and we really want to encourage people to get on board and get down to Queen's Park if they can. Of course, with injured workers, it's always a challenge. And so some workers take up locally. I'm sure that's happening in London. I know for sure in Thunder Bay, they've got a great big plan. The Thunder Bay injured workers carried Zooms throughout the pandemic, and so they've kind of linked up not just Canada, but also Australia is having an injured worker day now.
Okay, great.
As a result of that work.
Yeah. And
also we have contacts in the United States. So that will be very exciting to carry on, to rebuild, to unite our groups, and we have a strong support from the union movement now because of this representation being attacked through the KPMG audit. So they're stepping forward and they're quite vocal. They see what's going to happen to these health and safety reps who represent the unionized workers.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What are the changes being proposed to the actual health and safety reps?
Well, they face the same cuts to the timelines.
Right.
So one representative from UFCW told me that if she told her president of her union she needed more money because she has to, or more help or more time, you have to hire 3 more health and safety reps in order to get it all the paperwork in on time, right? Like she was already 3 years behind in her work. So it's an attack on the unions.
So they're seeing that this actually will prevent them from representing their members effectively.
Yeah, this is an attack on representation all the way around. Yeah.
Now, June 1st in Toronto, what's the program for the day if people if they're able to attend?
Well, they should arrive at 11.
Yep.
And there'll be speakers. Okay. And they should bring their own posters. I hope that this video helps people to know what to put on the poster. Hopefully, no KPMG and stop the funding employers and fund the system, you know, those kind of posters. So perhaps this video will help people with that.
In the past, there's been an overnight vigil, I think, the night before. Is that happening again this year?
We've had overnight vigils for many years, and it's the Sisters of Spirit, and the women took up that injured workers can't sleep well at night, so they did an overnight vigil, and you know, the pandemic affected a lot of things. We weren't able to do it, kind of hard to keep things going. So this is a big boost for us to reorganize and collectively rely on each other, our labor councils, try to outreach to more injured workers that they should join the groups, and yeah.
Great. Well, Christine, thanks for joining us here today.
Well, thanks for the conversation. It was wonderful. Thank you.
We encourage you who are watching, if you can, make it to Toronto on June 1st. If there's no local event happening in your area, maybe consider organizing one, or come to monuments that are in communities across Ontario, and at 11 o'clock maybe be part of this now International Day of Justice for Injured Workers.